Welcome to another edition of the Best Business Minds, where we interview business leaders and academics that write thought-provoking books. I'm Marc Kramer, a serial entrepreneur who consults with family businesses and entrepreneurs. This is our 103rd show, so I thank all of you from around the world who participate. Today's guest is Frank Cespedes, author of Sales Management That Works. It's a fabulous book, especially when you're trying to grow sales in this very chaotic time. And Frank, welcome.
Mark, thank you very much. Absolute pleasure to be with you, and thanks for hosting me.
Well, Frank, let's start with you talking about your background and the business that you're in.
Well, my background is not particularly exotic. I got my doctorate, started teaching at Harvard Business School. I was a marketing professor, made my way up the hierarchy. And then after 10 years, I left with some others. We started a business, a professional services firm. We grew that business and got lucky. I could spin this a different way, but it was dumb luck. We exited at exactly the right time. Harvard called me up and said, how'd you like to come back and teach? My research when I was a professor always had to do with companies' go-to-markets. But then when you run a business, as you know, Mark, and you've got to meet payroll every month, you develop a new appreciation for sales. So that was part of my motivation.
And why did you write this book and select this particular title?
It's a fair question because it's not like the world is waiting breathlessly for another book about sales. In fact, if you go to Amazon to the book section and in keywords put in sales, out will come over 80,000 items.
Wow.
As far as I can tell, the only management topic that gets more SKUs at Amazon is, quote, leadership. Gets about 90,000, but sales is a close second. I had two motivations in writing the book. The first one is fundamentally a professional, intellectual motivation. Of all the functions in business, sales is by far the most context specific. Selling software is different than selling capital goods, is different than selling professional services. Selling in North America is different than selling in Latin America, the Middle East, or Asia. And yet, for some reason, sales is also that business topic where people feel very comfortable making huge generalizations that are usually unsupported by any data whatsoever beyond what in academia we would call N equals 1. When I sold for Google, I did it this way, so should you. When we invested in PayPal, that kind of thing. And so, someone who's done, I think, reasonable research about this topic for almost 30 years, who's run a business, who has sold, I wanted to write a book that says this is what research does and does not tell you about this core activity. And my second motivation is I think it's a good time for a book like that. There is no doubt whatsoever that online technologies, the data revolution that will continue throughout our lifetimes, no doubt they are affecting buying and selling. But my reading of what people say about this is that they simply misunderstand the managerial implications and business development realities. And, I wanted to write a book that sort of says, hey, this, don't believe a lot of the conventional wisdom you're hearing these days.
And how has Zoom and technologies, really, how has the pandemic changed selling today? Because I hear a lot of people saying they're still not getting on planes, still not going in person, and still not even going back to the office. So how has all this changed?
Well, I mean, a couple of things. I think fundamentally what the pandemic has done is accelerate trends that were already in place before COVID hit the world. And The most important thing about technology is and always has been its impact on buying. And that's the big deal. What the pandemic has done is accelerated the trend toward omni-channel buying. Now, that does not mean, and this is where, here's my advice to your listeners, and I mean this literally, I don't mean this just rhetorically. If I were listening about this topic, I would apply a very high discount factor to most, and by most, I mean over 90% of the so-called new normal predictions that you're hearing about the impact of the pandemic. They're pure speculation and unsupported by the data. But the pandemic has accelerated that trend toward omni-channel buying. Now, let me give you an example, all right? An example both of the why I say a lot of these new normal predictions are nonsense and where I think the real impact is. Let's look at e-commerce, online buying, as a percentage of retail sales. We have good data about that. What was that percentage just before the pandemic, all right? End of 2019. The answer is about 11.5%. When I ask executives, what do you think that number was? I typically get estimates from 30 to 60%. In other words, executives are not a little bit out of touch with buying realities. They're orders of magnitude out of touch. Then you ask yourself, what happened during the pandemic? Here, the most relevant data is the second quarter of 2020, because that was thus far, let's hope it doesn't get worse. That was thus far maximum lockdown conditions in the United States. Now, obviously, when stores are held to 25 or 50% of their capacity, when people legitimately feel that if they go into a store, they may catch a virus and die, obviously there's going to be more buying and selling that occurs online. What was the percentage of e-commerce as a percentage of retail sales? Q2 of 2020, 15.5%. In other words, even in those conditions, it went up 5%. It's been trending down every quarter since.
Wow.
Q4 of 2022, down to less than 13%. By the way, same thing is true work from home. Spiked up to about 40% second quarter of 2020, now down to 18% only a year later. And many of those people are gig workers who have always, quote, worked from home. Now, does this mean that the internet is not a big deal? No. What it does mean is it's not a digital eats physical world. It's an omni-channel buying world that requires a multi-channel response. And that's a big deal. That's what my book is about. It's about how this affects all the core areas of sales management.
We have a question from the audience. Frank, would you consider the term business development to mean sales?
It certainly includes sales, but part of my point of view about this topic is that sales, and by sales I mean profitable sales, customer acquisition and retention, is always an organizational outcome. It depends on other things beyond, but certainly including, the street smarts, the skills of the salesperson, product, price, etc. That's what I mean by business development. And it's companies that ultimately sell, not only salespeople.
You wrote that moving sequentially through a funnel isn't happening anymore, but buyers are now work through parallel activity streams. You started to talk about this. Can you explain further?
Yeah, and it's really what I mean by the omni-channel buying. And I'm going to get academic with the audience just for a moment, but bear with me because I think it makes the point. For over 60 years, the way buying has been conceptualized, and as a result, the way selling is talked about, is in terms of what academics call a hierarchy of effects model. And what they mean by that is that the job is to move the prospect sequentially from awareness to interest to desire to action to close. AIDA, AIDA, as in the Verdi opera. And by the way, that look at buying and selling is built into virtually every bit of CRM software that is out there. But I think, what the research tells us, and I think some reflection on your own experience tells you, that's just not the way buying works by the third decade of the 21st century in most categories. Buyers are online and offline, dealing with influencers, buying forums and B2B, etc., multiple times during their buying journey. It's not a pipeline. It's not a funnel. It's a series of streams. And one of the issues in sales is understanding that and knowing when the salesperson is in the best position to interact with the prospect. So that's what I mean by that. We understand how this happens in consumer buying, right? You go to your phone. Same thing goes on in B2B in multiple areas. This does not mean the disappearance of the salesperson. Number of salespeople in the United States have increased consistently throughout the 21st century, even as the internet has expanded in scope, bandwidth, etc. But it does mean that selling changes dramatically because the buyer now shows up already with product comparisons, price information, etc. That's why it's a big deal.
I think it's a godsend, the internet, when you go to buy and you're able to go and check the pricing out, and especially either online or in person. I saw something on Facebook ad, and I used to buy direct from those ads, but now I go and check those ads against Amazon and see if the price is different. And oftentimes I find that the price is 15, 20% more that I saw it on Facebook. And
yeah, but I would make a distinction here. I agree with what you just said. And Amazon is a good example. I think Amazon's an excellent buying experience if you know what you want, but it's a horrible shopping experience. And by the way, this is a big deal. It's a big deal because, as I said earlier, information is only increasing. Access is only increasing. There is a role, and you see this happening in multiple categories. There is a role for curation. That's one of the key tasks most salespeople play.
How are technologies like artificial intelligence affecting the way companies sell and buyers purchase?
Yeah. I'm going to get a little snarky for a bit, Mark, but the phrase artificial intelligence, it's a little bit like these other phrases, digital transformation, leadership. You can drive a truck through that phrase. I sit on boards. I work with, boards of advisors and other things with lots of startups. And one I work with is a so-called AI firm, but the CIO is my kind of CIO, low BS. And I like the way he phrases it. He says, listen, when I talk to investors and clients, I talk about artificial intelligence. When I talk to my people, I talk about correlations, right? Now, I think artificial intelligence, what we typically mean by that, once we get beyond the sloganeering and the, let's use the phrase to raise money sort of thing, what we typically mean is that we're somehow using data analytics to make some predictive, add some predictive capabilities to what we're doing. Now, I think there are a couple of things to be said about that in sales. One is I get back to the basics. Sales is very context specific. You'll find, I think, that most of those predictive analytics work well. This is why SaaS businesses are almost always the examples. They work well when the nature of the buying in the category is repetitive. There's a cadence, right? I got to get the household goods, whatever. They work much less well when that is not true, when buying is episodic, You're either in the market or you're out of the market, consumer durables, etc. I think the real value of a lot of these analytics is not so much in predicting the buying, because that's affected by so many exogenous variables the company doesn't control, but it helps in dealing with the ability to increase productivity in your sales model, knowing where we need our best and most expensive people and where we don't, knowing when we need people as opposed to an algorithm can do that. So again, I think it's like most things in business. This is what I teach. This is the way I ran my business very profitably. If you can't bring a big phrase down to earth and explain how it affects how you would or wouldn't allocate resources, my attitude is save that for Davos, save it for places where, go make it a TED talk, areas where nobody allocates any resources.
That's true. How are salespeople being trained today that is different than it was in the past?
Well, part of what you'll read in my book is that, unfortunately, it's not that different. The data here is I think, very, very telling. The reality is companies spend 20% more per capita, per person, on training and sales than they do in any other business function. But the ROI of that training is notoriously disappointing. And there are systemic reasons for that, right? Most sales training is episodic. All right, you bring people in when you're introducing a new product, and what the learning people call the forgetting curve is very, very steep. And the research about this is pretty darn good. Most salespeople forget 80% of what they learned in a training seminar within 90 days. I mean, that's a good, it's a good example of short-termism, right? 1 quarter. Most training ignores the way adults learn. Right? Salespeople are not studying for the final exam in my course. That's not part of their learning experience. They pay attention to information when and where they need it, which is usually on the way to making a call or during the actual conversation itself. Now, this is where I think the state-of-the-art companies with sales training are making strides. This is where technology is and should be the seller's friend. There are now lots of technologies that, by the way, are coming down in price. God bless capitalism, because of competition. There are lots of sales enablement technologies that allow you to do that just-in-time learning, which is so important in sales. And the companies I'm thinking about here, Showpad, Gong, DocSend, etc. But like any tool, it's only as good as the user. You still have to understand your buyer and how they buy today, not yesterday. And you still have to have the data that tells you when in that stream of buying my salespeople can exert the most influence. But if you know the answers to those questions and keep the answers relevant, technology can help you make the training better. But I'm now talking, and I want to be very clear about this. In my experience, and my experience here is pretty good. Once upon a time, I looked like Jimi Hendrix, Mark. I'm talking about like 10% of the companies out there. The other 80 to 90% are still doing training the way they did it 10, 20, 30 years ago, and they're not getting the results that are available to them.
Well, I think that folks are closed off to a constant improvement, and they feel like it worked that way 10, 20 years ago. It'll still work that way, even though the world is changing and they're not adapting.
Well, I think that's one reason. I mean, I think, that closed-mindedness is always part of it. But I think we have to be very, very clear about this. Sales is always a tough place to institute change in an organization. And the reason is fundamental, systemic, as we would say today. So many other decisions, so many other resource allocations in any company depend on sales forecasts and the ability of the sales force to make those forecasts. As a result, the metrics in sales tend to reinforce, I want you to make sure you make the numbers next week, next month, next quarter. And as a result, change is tough because if you're in sales, because of your metrics, because of what you hear from your other colleagues, you stick with the devil even as buying changes. That's how companies get disrupted, but it's built into the function. And if you don't recognize that, you're gonna do what most digital transformation projects are currently doing. They're basically task forces.
A question from the audience. Does the salesman have to be an advisor of choices available to prospects? I think this relates to another question he asked, which is what is curation in this context? Products and prices, a cliche analogy, but Progressive shows the prices of other insurers. So what's your thoughts on this?
Well, I mean, why does Progressive do that? It does that because generally speaking, Progressive is saying, guess what? You get better coverage for less money from us. I don't think the job of the salesperson is to persuade the buyer to buy someone else's product. I don't think that's a good idea. All right. I also think if you get back to what I said earlier, there's a sense, and I mean this respectfully, but there's a sense in which the question is academic. Most buyers now do have access to those product and price comparisons. They're very easy. And especially in B2B categories, you have more and more buyer forums where you not only get access to product and price comparisons, you can talk to other people that bought the product and they can tell you what works, what doesn't, are there claims about service relevant, etc. Where I think the curation comes in, and this, sounds old school, but, the most important things in business are easy to say and hard to do. It's still about selling solutions and outcomes. It's still about understanding that buyer, their context, what ROI means for them, not for some platonic ideal. It's like what I tell startups. Very rarely do you meet an entrepreneur who hasn't identified a big opportunity, a big market. But my advice is always the same. Always remember, a market in the history of business, since the Phoenicians, a market has never bought anything. Only customers buy. And that's where the curation comes in. But if I can be blunt about this, I wouldn't feel sorry for buyers. As a general rule, what technology has done is empowered buyers at the expense of sellers. So, it's not a level playing field. But again, that's part of why capitalism adds so much value.
Yeah, my dad would miss my dad used to love to negotiate for cars, fight with them, walk out, stomp out, come back. And now this takes all the fun out of it for him because pretty much when you go to a car dealer, they go, hey, let's take a look. You want that Ford Escape? Let's see who's selling it in the 50-mile radius.
Yeah.
We can beat that price. Not much to negotiate after that. Either you want that car or not. And those guys have taken out because all they care about is let's just close their sales quicker.
Well, car buying is actually, and as you know, you are an interviewer who actually reads the books. God bless. But there's that data in the book about this, and it's a very good example. And by the way, the data has held up during the pandemic. The reality now in the United States, the average car buyer spends almost 14 hours online researching the product. You go to Edmunds.com, autotrader.com, right? But over 95% of cars are still bought in the dealership. But anybody, your dad is the exception here. Your dad actually liked the Persian rug bazaar at the dealer. But anybody who's bought a car in the United States, starting 20 years ago, realizes it's a much, much nicer process now, not because the dealers have gone to Bible school, but because of what technology has done to empower the buyer and their information.
I think so. I always tell my students, nobody ever sells you anything. You sell yourself, because when you go to that car salesman, he's now just asking you to tell him exactly what's the profile of what you're looking to buy, and then narrows down the choices and then gives you the insights into the choices you're thinking about. But essentially, you've already walked in wanting to buy this car, and now he's just being an advisor, consultant to you to figure out what's the best match.
I think, yeah.
What skill sets do salespeople have to develop to succeed today?
Well, the basics always count. All right. And by the basics, I mean doing your homework, active listening, etc. But, and what I'm about to say, you should expect in any competitive activity. And in a free market, business in general and selling in particular are competitive activities. What you should expect is that over time, the bar is rising. Why is that? When I say what I'm about to say, many of our listeners may say, duh, of course, but it's astounding to me how many companies forget this. If you're in business, you don't compete with companies that have gone out of business, right? They're dead. You only compete with the survivors in an industry. And in order to survive, you've got to adopt best practices. That's why the bar keeps rising. And if you look at selling in particular, and again, there's data in the book about this, what you'll find is that the skills that were considered, state of the art 10, 15 years ago, the ability to develop leads, etc., are now much lower down on the list. And other skills, data analytics, the ability to navigate across boundaries in your own company, because it's more of a cross-functional activity, etc., they're much higher on the list. Now, why is that? Does that mean that listening and the basics, don't count? No. The way to interpret that data is in keeping with the old joke that many of our listeners may know, the joke about the two men who are out hunting, they shoot a bear, but only wound it. The enraged bear starts to chase them. As they're running, one guy says, hey, we're not going to outrun the bear. The other guy says, all I got to do is outrun you.
Right.
That's competition. Competitive advantage in business is always relative advantage. Those skills are now table stakes, and it's the others that make a difference. I'll give advice to any sales managers who may be listening, because I see this on the boards that I sit on. But what the data revolution is doing in many, many companies, if you look at the data analytics groups in many companies, and by many, I mean more than 50%, according to the research, those groups don't report up through sales or marketing or what we now call the chief revenue officer, right? They report up through the finance function. And finance people, as I'm sure you've discovered, are annoying. Once they get data, they start to ask questions. Well, why do you spend the money this way? What is your cost to serve different segments? Yeah, I understand what you're telling me about the top line, but the way we accrete enterprise value is by maximizing return on invested capital. How do you do that? The point I want to make is that it's not only selling competencies that are changing, but sales management competencies as well. If you're less than 40 years old and you're going to make a career in sales, the requirements for financial literacy in that function are increasing dramatically. Make sure you're comfortable with that language, because it's going to affect your promotional opportunities.
Frank, you're totally right. I write a lot of business plans and put together a lot of financial models, and I'm doing it for 2 clients right now. And a lot of entrepreneurs are not able to explain their own math. about their business. They can't explain how they arrived at this number. This idea of giving, we're going to get 10% of the market doesn't fly with anybody. They got to show step by step about how you're actually going to get those sales, and what's that going to cost for customer acquisition cost.
Yeah.
And
Well,
we really
and
need
even
to understand the detail.
yeah, no, I agree. And I'll give you an example. Some of our listeners may laugh at this, but this is real. As I say, I do a fair amount of work with startups, VC firms, private equity. I was at a meeting about 2 months ago. This was a tech software entrepreneur, and they were pitching us. And what they were pitching was a metric called EBITDA Ma. I hadn't heard of that. What it is this is what our profitability would be if you took out our sales and marketing expenses, which, by the way, we're running at about 65% of sales. One of the VCs, I thought, asked a good question. He said, "Are you telling me that if you were 8 feet tall, you could play in the NBA?" And this entrepreneur, with no irony, said, "Yes." And the VC said the right thing. He said, "But you're not 8 feet tall." So, this is increasingly an important part, as it should be, of doing business.
How much should you budget to train salespeople, and what has changed when training today's sales professionals?
There's no one number for this. It's going to vary company by company, but I'll say two things about this topic. One qualitative, the other more quantitative. The qualitative comment, I teach at Harvard Business School. I have off and on for 30 years. And, we write case studies. And
yeah,
I
that's
thank
what you're known
Harvard
for
that. All right. That's how I really learned about business beyond all the models that I studied in graduate school. One of the very first cases I ever wrote, an executive said something to me that I later found had a tremendous amount of truth. And he said, "Frank, watch what you're going to see in your career. Most companies maintain their equipment better than they maintain their people." And he's right about that. And his point was that ultimately, if you don't invest in this sort of thing, you will get what you don't pay for. All right. And that's what happens. Now, the quantitative data is this. We're living right now because of the pandemic, government policies, and other things. It's obviously what we call the war for talent is obviously raging, right? But here's the data about sales. And absent a pandemic, it's actually remarkably consistent for decades. Sales turnover in the United States tends to vary between 20 and 30% annually. It's higher in conditions like the current environment, where people with talent have more options. It's lower when the economy is in a recession or whatever, but it tends to vary from 20 to 30%. Now, think about what that means. What it means is that for the vast majority of companies, you've got to hire, train, socialize the equivalent of the entire sales force in your company every 3 to 5 years. There's no one number, but this is not the kind of activity where you do it once and, then, as they say in New York, forget about it. No, yeah. This is a perennial cycle. And if you can make incremental improvements in that process, that's, that number for the 20 to 30%, in many companies, the amount of money they spend on hiring, training, development, et cetera, is bigger than the number for their biggest CapEx projects. So it's worth paying attention to.
A question from the audience: how should universities' sales programs change based on your findings? Would they be up to the new challenges?
Yeah, great question. And what I'm about to say may sound contradictory, but I don't think so. So first, bear with me. The question says, how should university programs change? Well, the first thing to be said about universities and sales is most of them don't have any programs, right? Um, of the nearly 5,000 colleges and universities in the United States, last time I looked, which was about 3 years ago when I started this book, less than 300 even offered a sales course, let alone a sales program, right? In other words, this is a line of work where the vast majority of people start out knowing very little about what they're going to get paid for. Now, the question then becomes, what should universities do about this? There are lots of reasons universities have trouble with the topic of sales. It's inherently a cross-disciplinary topic. If you want to do it well, you got to know something about economics. You got to certainly know something about marketing and buying. You got to know something about psychology and persuasion. What's one of the very best books ever written about sales? Not written by a salesperson. It was written by Bob Cialdini at the University of Arizona. His great classic book on persuasion. Universities are not set up for that kind of cross-functional work. And secondly, if you take seriously, as I think you must, what I said at the beginning of our discussion, Mark, sales is very context specific. The danger with universities doing this is, what we say quite legitimately about the military. The generals are always fighting the last war.
Yeah, right.
Right. So I think, watch what you wish for here. And fundamentally, if you're going to teach this to undergraduates, focus on the basics. And I mean the basics, because the world is going to change and sales is always at the coalface for those changes.
I have to tell you, the beauty of schools like Harvard and Wharton, because I taught at Wharton, is that the professors are still in the mix, that they're actually still working in the real world, working with these companies, whether advisors, consultants, or they're investors in these startups. And many of the schools I've worked at and other universities, the professors have been so far removed from what's actually happening that they're like those generals, not only teaching from the last war, but maybe 2-3 wars ago, and they're too removed.
Mark, as far as I'm concerned, flattery will get you everywhere.
That's just true.
I'd like to think that what you said is true. Generally, I don't know. I just don't know.
Yeah, that's been my experience at schools like yours or Wharton's. You write about the importance of product demonstrations and sales presentations. Is there a difference in terms of success rate in person versus virtual?
I am not familiar with data that tells us, that answers the question that you're raising. And it's a good question, because if you believe a lot of what you're hearing about buyers don't want to deal face-to-face, etc., this has become important. But let me give you my point of view about this. And my data here is as good as anyone else's, because they don't have much data. I've got some, but I don't want to say it's conclusive. I think that what we learn in general from the history of technology, and what we learn by looking at sales in the 21st century, is that it is not a digital eats physical world. That is simply not true. I showed you the data, mentioned the data earlier about e-commerce, but it is an omni-channel world. It is a hybrid world. I think the reality for most companies is not that, an algorithm or the website is going to replace the salesperson. That's not true for most companies. But their challenge, and it's a big challenge if you get back to what I said earlier about why change is difficult here, their challenge is taking sales models that for good reasons have always been fairly labor-intensive account-based models and integrating into them the productivity improvements that online and digital can provide. And here I think the pandemic has been a wake-up call for many companies, not because it demonstrated to them that they don't need salespeople. All right. You still see the pure play direct to commerce firms opening stores. Why would they spend money on that unless, they had buying evidence? But what the pandemic has demonstrated to many companies is that, in effect, they were overpaying for many tasks in their sales models. We don't need our, $150,000 enterprise reps doing lead generation, not the best use of their time. We can do that in a SaaS model with kids right out of college, or we can often do it through some inbound marketing, etc. We don't need to have every meeting in person. There are demos you can do online. That's what I mean by the hybrid model. I think that's where most companies need to be focusing. Technology is typically a complement to what is going on, not a substitute. And again, all I can say is look at the evidence in the book. I think sales is exhibit A when it comes to that sort of thing.
What are the top 3 to 5 activities based on your research that influence buying decisions?
Product, price, budget, the basics. All right. What's the product? What's it going to do? What's the price? Do I have a budget to buy this? So I think, never lose sight of that. And that's part of what any salesperson has to understand, because, as I said earlier, markets don't buy, only customers do. But that would still be at the top of my list. Now, I'm saying that because I think it gets at a fundamental truth about business that many people, and frankly, many sales managers forget. Profitable sales, profitable growth in a company is ultimately an organizational outcome. It depends on our product, our price. Do we or don't we have a coherent business strategy, as well as the way we manage sales? And many companies, I think, make a fundamental mistake. They believe that even an effective sales model, an efficient sales model, can substitute for an incoherent business strategy, and it can't. So my answer to your question is, remember the basics here. Persuasion takes place once you've got the basics in place, not instead of the basics.
When I was entering the workforce, and I hate to say this, back in the 80s, the ads for salespeople always mentioned the employer's interest in people with a sports background. Remember those ads? They always said,
Yep.
Did you play high school or college sports? Is that still the case? And what does the profile of a potentially great sales professional look like?
Yeah. Yes, you still hear that a lot. I think here's my take on this. You hear that because the sports metaphor for the person who's using it is typically meant as a surrogate for 2 other qualities. One is, hey, they've got grit, as we would now say, persistence. They get tackled, they get back up on their feet. Obviously, that's important in sales. And then the other is sports somehow supposed to say so-and-so is a team player.
Right.
Now, does the fact that she played lacrosse as an undergraduate tell us she has those qualities? I think the answer is, it's hit and miss. Here's, I think, the most important thing to understand about sales hiring. And what I am about to say is as close to an established fact as anything you will ever hear from a management professor. It is supported by over 60 years of consistent research results. And I want to emphasize consistent. The correlation between the evaluations that people get in their interviews and their subsequent actual on-the-job performance tends to vary between 0.2 and 0.4. In other words, even in the best of circumstances, it's less than the 50-50 rate of flipping a coin. Managers, and especially sales managers, vastly overrate their ability to predict somebody's fit and performance on the basis of interviews. Now, I have colleagues at Harvard and other places who are very familiar with that research, and their advice to companies is therefore don't interview. My own feeling is that only someone who's never run a business can seriously say that. Surely you interview. People have to hire people. People work with people. But if you take that data seriously, and I think you must, I mean, you're unlikely to be the exception to this 70 years of consistent research, you have to augment interviews with other activities in order to figure out whether playing sports makes any damn bit of difference at all. Sales in particular is ultimately about behavior. It's not about dress for success. It's not about how well they smiled in the interview. It's about behavior. So what do you want to do there? You want to make sure that in the hiring process itself, you put in place activities that give you a sense of that behavior. Whenever possible, you want to engage in internship hiring practices. Now, when I say that to companies in the current environment, they say, oh, Frank, we can't do that. It's a war for talent. I always say the same thing. Listen, you and I both know what you're going to do 6 months from now, 9 months from now, with a sales hire who doesn't work out. You can use whatever euphemism you want, but probably that person's going to get fired. Why not be upfront about the internship? And by the way, you can then put together hiring packages that give you an advantage in hiring in the current environment. But again, a sole reliance on interviews, which is by far, the way sales hiring occurs, the data says basically you're not even flipping a coin. You're doing worse than flipping a coin.
I've run 25 startups, I used to hire salespeople as consultants and said, let's just see how the first 90 days goes. See if you like us, see if you feel comfortable selling it. If it's good, then we'll convert you over. If it's not, doesn't harm your reputation, nothing, we all just go our separate ways.
Exactly what I'm talking about. And you're exactly right the way you phrase it, Mark. That is a two-way process. Nobody, not even your future boss, can really tell you what it's like to work in the organization until you work there. I think that's exactly the way to do it.
And look how many people have failed. I remember the president of Yahoo brought on the head of sales for Google, and he lasted, 6 months? And they thought, oh my God, he'll kill it. They gave him like a $25 million package to come over. And within 6 months, they found that he wasn't the right guy in their environment, selling their kind of service, their product services that they were offering. And they were like, my God, we just made this $25 million investment because we guaranteed all of these things. And just like you see in pro football, guys are all pro in one system and he's getting cut in the next system.
Well, again, that goes back to, your good question to me at the beginning. Why'd you write this book? Sales is very context specific. Virtually every company I know has an experience like this. I'm sure many of our listeners do. So-and-so was a star at X. We brought her in. Somehow she doesn't perform here the way she performed there. Now step back and think about that. It's not as though when that person left that company, they suddenly got stupid or they lost their individual capabilities. Sales is context specific. When that person leaves company A and comes to company B, all the internal relationships, sales is an organizational outcome, all those internal relationships are left behind. She has to recreate them. Part of the job of the sales manager, part of the job of the company is not to do what many companies do. Well, we hired you. Let's see how it works out. You figure it out. That's just not good. That doesn't make sense for shareholders. Part of the job is to accelerate that internal relationship building process that is so fundamental to effective selling in most markets.
Yeah, I think you answered the next question from the audience, which is I'd like to get clarity on something said. Profitable growth depend on organizational fill in the blank. So I think that you kind of covered that with your last answer. The other thing I'm always amazed at, and when I write business plans for clients, and they're looking to hire salespeople, and they always go to like some name brand, company. Let's hire somebody from Hewlett Packard or whatever. And I'll say to them, don't you want to hire somebody who's never sold something that nobody ever heard of before? Because if you're selling Bloomberg terminals, that sells itself. The salespeople just show up and it sells itself. Or a money manager who is in the top quartile and he's paying salespeople a percentage of the assets. Like, why would you even do that? Because when you walk in, all they're doing is saying, show me the number, and then they're being hired to go and manage that person's money. The reverse is also true.
Yeah.
No matter how great the salesperson is in terms of their people skills, if you got shitty returns, nobody wants you.
Yeah, but I think first I agree with you. I think that is common practice. And I think there are two things going on there. One, as usual in business, something on the supply side, something on the demand side. On the supply side, the people doing the hiring and say, well, let's go, get them from, whatever is the current allegedly best practice company. I think what they have in mind is that they see a trade-off. I think it's a false trade-off. If you go back to what we said earlier, but if I hire this person, the extra money I pay is money I don't have to spend on training, socialization, etc. That I think is false. They still have to recreate things. Then on the demand side, it's not completely irrational in many industries. Let me use healthcare as an example. Healthcare is what? Now it's about 20% of our GDP.
Yeah.
It's extremely diverse, right? It's everything from medical equipment to drugs to services. But the vast majority of that flows through hospitals. As a result, if you have good experience selling to hospitals, understanding the buying units, navigating the halls of those bureaucracies, that's a very transferable skill across multiple healthcare categories. That is not true in a lot of industries. So, there, as usual in business, as I said, there are reasons for this, some of which, in my opinion, don't hold water, and some of which do apply in specific contexts.
A question from the audience. Is there a good AI program for sales? For example, to use online or on telephone call centers?
I don't know. That's beyond my pay grade. But I would say this, if the program, what does it mean to be a good AI program in this context? Presumably it means the software doesn't have glitches. It's got some algorithm in it that, holds up to statistically significant testing. But that's like chapter 1 of War and Peace in sales. The rest of the novel is about how do I use that in my market, with my products, with my pricing, with my context. Peter Drucker, I hope, Mark, I'm
Everybody
sure
knows
you
him.
remember,
Sure.
right? I use his name now with a little hesitation. I mentioned Peter Drucker to MBA students last semester, and it was like I said, hey, remember Julius Caesar? But, Peter Drucker was a very smart guy. He wrote an article in the 1960s. That's a long time ago, all right? The article was called The Manager and the Moron. And the moron is the computer and the software. And what Drucker pointed out is that the software is a moron, all right? The software does what you ask it to do. But what makes it very valuable is that it forces you to set the criteria. It forces you to define what it is we're trying to do. And that remains true even when we have allegedly self-correcting programs as in artificial intelligence. Managers must manage. You can't escape that. I mean, that's just the reality of business.
I thought it was interesting in the book that social media, especially among people under the age of 35, have been flat overall, but shrinking, really shrinking among young people. Why is that, especially since that's a major tactic by business?
Yeah. Why it's shrinking among young people, I don't know. I suspect because, what's cool. I always quote Coco Chanel. Remember the great Coco Chanel?
Yeah, of
Her
course.
definition of fashion. Coco Chanel said, by definition, fashion is what goes out of fashion. I think that's true in social media. What I can speak about, however, is the business issue here. And here again, the pandemic has accelerated a trend. But the costs of acquiring customers through online marketing media looks like a ski slope in Aspen over the last decade. And unfortunately, it's going up, not down. And this is a very, very big issue. Online marketing media are increasingly cluttered, increasingly expensive. A classic example of the law of diminishing returns, and very, very high maintenance. If you're going to do that now, you've got to stay in touch in detail. This is not an area for amateurs. You've got to stay in touch in detail with the algorithms of multiple platforms that come and go. How many people listening to us could even spell TikTok accurately as recently as 2 or 3 years ago? There's a joke making its way among CMOs, chief marketing officers in tech firms. And the joke is, where's the best place to bury a body? Answer, page 2 of Amazon or Google or Facebook, because nobody goes there.
Absolutely.
That's where we'll probably find Jimmy Hoffa, that kind of thing. So I think that's the important issue. It is just darned expensive and getting more so to do this. That's why I say it's about a hybrid world. It is not a digital eats physical world.
Well, I mean, look at Facebook now that their precision advertising is being kind of taken away from them, which people just don't realize. Without that, that means the cost of goods have to go up because the cost of customer acquisition goes up. And now you're going to be paying more, because the promise of the internet, right, when we started was, hey, you're not going to get ads that you weren't interested in. And I appreciate the fact that if I'm looking at backpacks, now I'm flooded with backpack ads, but hey, I'm looking for a backpack at this time. And eventually that stops when I stop looking for backpacks.
I agree with you that, and you're exactly right. That was at the heart of the promise of online marketing. And by the way, I think this is only the beginning. I mean, there's lots of incentives for politicians and regulators to increase privacy laws, not the least of which is to shut down discourse, among people they don't like to hear the discourse from. You're going to hear more and more of this, and you're right. All that does is increase what is already a very quickly accelerating cost of customer acquisition through those media.
You write about the viral effect of sharing information on product is surprisingly minimal. Less than 4% share more than once, which kind of surprised me when I read this stat. Why is that, and how can organizations increase that number? Because that's what they're hoping for. Like Tim Draper, right? He was the father of talking about the viral effect.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that data comes from a colleague of mine. His name's Sunil Gupta, who looks at this topic in detail, and his data is based on all the major platforms that we talk about. And I think you're right. I think a big part of the attraction of online marketing media for some years is this notion of virality. Now, you know how this works in tech. Tech people love to reinvent the wheel, right? We used to talk about word of mouth. Now we talk about virality. All right, give them the language. But what Sunil finds, and I think the reasons for this are the clutter that I talked about. There's a notion which I think is true. The sociologists call this the megaphone effect, that what social media does is allow people who already agree with each other to speak to each other, right? That's why we have political polarization increasing. I think there's truth to that. But what Sunil's data says is that the vast majority of people are just talking to themselves. Nobody reads it. And in fact, what his data says is that it's only about 7% of these social media messages that even get read by 8 people or more. The point being that going viral is the exception, not the rule. It's very, very difficult to do. And because of the increasing clutter, getting even more difficult to do.
Frank, I want to thank you so much because you must be a fabulous professor. I would love to have been in your class because you have such great energy and the research you've done is terrific. The book is great, but I could have spent the rest of the day just hearing you talk about these different topics. So I hope that we'll have you on again another time and maybe even talk about one of your other books as well. Everyone, have a great weekend. Again, Frank, thanks for taking the time to speak with us. And we look forward to staying in contact.
Mark, thank you. Would love to come back. Thank you.
Bye, everyone. Have a great weekend.